back.
Sorry, let me just make sure we are recording. Okay, sorry, I beg your pardon. Who was that? I missed
Me.
speaking. Hello, Ashley. How are you?
Hello. Good. How are you?
Okay, so
Because we were the first group.
yeah.
We're just curious.
So the group presentation marks should actually be posted 2 weeks after the presentation. So all of the marks and the comments have been uploaded up until last week, being week 8. So I just need to double check whether they're visible. Clearly you can't see them because otherwise you wouldn't have asked the question. All right. So I'll just double check and make sure that they're visible, but they should be open in the next couple of days. All the marking and everything like that has actually been completed. So it's up to date from that respect. Obviously, you know that the major essay is due in week 11 and there is a discussion thread up on views. Should you have any questions with respect to the major essay that you think would be beneficial for other students as well who might have similar questions or queries, feel free to post that on the views thread as opposed to emailing me, because it might well be that there's more than one student who has that same question. But just in terms of some general queries that I tend to get at this point in time, one of them tends to be in relation to the word count. So academic protocol would apply in the sense that it's 10% below or 10% above the word count is permissible without penalty, which means anything from 1,800 words to 2,200 words is quite acceptable. Intent are included in the word count, but the reference list is not. Please take note that the comments so avoid multiple emails coming through the same sort of query. And I mentioned at the beginning of the session that I was quite supportive of using headings and subheadings to structure the format of your essay. So please feel free to use that. Don't consider it only applicable to a report format. Given that the word length for this sort of essay, it would be quite acceptable given the fact that this is a research essay as well. So remember that you're only doing one of the 3 questions that are posted in the learning guide that are stipulated there. You're not doing all 3, you're only picking one of the 3 options, either question 1, question 2, or question 3. Make sure you have the marking rubric with you as a bit of an audit or a checklist in relation to the elements of what we're looking for. Don't get confused between ethical principles and ethical frameworks. When we're talking about frameworks, we're talking about the theories as included in the mind map, which you have in views for you. When we're talking about the principles, we're talking about, well, let me ask you, what do we mean by ethical principles? And the silence prevails. Come on, someone have a go.
It's and maleficence and all those principles.
That's correct. So it's the 4 principles of autonomy, maleficence, non-maleficence, or did I say beneficence? I didn't, did I? Autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice. Sorry, that was the 4th one. Okay, Holly, did you have your hand up? Or did I miss that? Is my computer lagging maybe?
I had a day.
Okay, the audio is a little bit lagging. I'm not sure whether it's on your end or my end. Can I just see a show of hand, well, just nodding, in fact. Is my audio coming through okay? Okay. All right, that's fine. And Charlotte, just before I do forget, I got your email and that's fine, okay? All right, okay, well, let's make a start. We do have presenters today. So it's Michelle, Muzda, and now where are my notes? I haven't forgotten you, and Caleb. Excellent. Okay, so whenever you guys are ready to start.
Hello, for those, can you guys hear us properly?
Yep.
Yes? Okay, cool. So for those of you guys who don't know, I'm Michelle.
I'm Caleb.
I'm Musta. And our topic today is about ethics and rationing. So we'll be discussing 2 articles. And the articles will discuss the ideas behind rationing and why rationing exists. These will explore rationing as a difficult notion for health professionals in regards to the treatment that patients receive, and also how patients are heavily impacted by medical interventions. I'll just share the screen.
Okay, so kind of like a definition of rationing and ethics, with rationing being the withholding of necessary treatments and resources within a healthcare system, thus kind of like depriving patients of receiving the best possible care. An article that we looked at by Johnson in 2015 states that governments aim to reform their health care systems in order to reduce the cost of healthcare services, although in the process the government ends up limiting these services instead. With ethics kind of just being a set of principles that shape the way an individual makes a decision, it's based on what they perceive as morally correct.
Yeah, so a little bit more about rationing. So the goal of rationing in terms of the government is to equalise the health options for the whole community, while aiming to provide sort of a personalised care to each individual as they need. The government in Australia does that by Medicare scheme, which sort of is guided by the Medical Service Advisory Committee. And this group basically determines what Medicare funding can cover for each Australian, including sort of your medical interventions, treatment options, your pathology tests, and the medications that they can have.
Right, so moving on to the first article, I'll just give like a quick rundown of what it is. So this the article is about an interview with a psychologist reflecting on a true story regarding the clinical impacts of rationing in the rural healthcare setting. So to give a quick summary, it's an interview with a psychologist named Sydney Bloch, which explains the tragic story of a young doctor sorting to assist a severely depressed elderly person, and due to the rationing of resources in the area, in this case a rural setting, the necessary treatment was unable to be performed, and unfortunately the patient passed away. The discussion then moves to the idea that the government makes policies around healthcare and resources based on a budget, and this will therefore determine how much assistance each person and each community will receive. Bloch argues that as health professionals, we should be the people to decide what level and to what extent a patient needs a treatment in a free-flow model, not a policymaker. And he also acknowledges the difficulty of budgets and resource scarcity, but remains adamant that the balance of power and the treatment options is in the wrong hands, and it should remain heavily with the health professional. So just onto our questions.
Yeah, so I don't know how many of you read the whole article, but it's quite a long sort of conversational interview. And there's a real conflict between the theories of sort of rationing healthcare and having what Bloch describes as a free-flow healthcare system. And so sort of the conflict between them having the healthcare in a variety of health disciplines. So as health science students, as we all are, have you guys experienced any sort of beneficial or detrimental sides of health rationing?
So this is either as practitioners of health that you're asking, or maybe
Or patients.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As practitioners of health. No stories to tell.
The stories.
Have you got any experiences yourself?
I personally have a condition called FSHMD, so facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy. And I find issues with this because having the condition I have to go to the physiotherapist and to a number of specialists quite a lot. And those costs are only marginally covered by the Medicare scheme.
Mm-hmm.
As a result, I end up forking out a lot of money to try and get to these appointments I have to go to. Whereas, for example, Muzda doesn't have any of those particular needs. And so there's a rationing of healthcare that allows both of us to access the same services, but that prevents me from getting the services I need that Worcester isn't using. So for me, I've seen the sort of the detrimental sides where it can cause more harm than good. But I think we can also understand as patients and health practitioners the need for Medicare and for making sure that people have basic health needs covered in the community.
Do you feel that the private health insurance system fills that gap adequately? And this is not just to you guys who are presenting, but to the group as a whole. For those of you who have private health insurance, does it do what it needs to fill that gap in terms of the out-of-pocket expenses and the affordability of treatment and services based on need? Or is it just more of the same?
I think it all depends really, obviously it's covering like a few dental expenses, but like as for me going to a gynecologist, I'm forking out like $200 a visit. Like it's not covering stuff like that.
Because I think the anecdotal evidence is that, you know, it's always been assumed that private health insurance is for those who can afford it, it's for the rich. But there's a whole middle class of people who are battling to pay private health insurance fees on the basis that it provides them with a degree or a level of stability and safety that the public scheme doesn't, that are finding it just as unaffordable. So I guess I'll just leave you with that thought. I don't have quite the answer for it, but I think that the private health insurance system is unsustainable as it is, and more people are actually opting out of it because the expense does not actually justify the benefits. I don't know whether anyone else has had similar sort of experiences or can verify that or disagrees with me. But certainly that seems to be a consensus just in terms of this idea of rationing. How do you make a system that's tight with fixed resources spread out as much as possible to cover the most? That's the question really that needs to be answered.
Yeah, so we'll touch on that a bit later as well, in terms of the ethical reason behind rationing. Is it ethical to expect people to put themselves short each week to try and cover their own expenses by rationing? Or are we better off having that free flow model that Bloch talks about in his first article?
On to the second question. So what ethical principles would the policymakers and health professionals base their opposing arguments on, and how have these been justified by each party?
So you're specifically talking there about the principles, not the theories. What do people think? I think you might need to call on people by name, guys.
Can you hear me?
Can now. Thank you, Holly.
Yeah, I think that that they would. Is it justice that supports like the fact that everything is equitable and fair towards everyone? So I think it would. I think that it would not be with the principle of justice because not everyone can afford it.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think most like policies go towards trying to do the biggest amount of good for the most amount of people. So I guess, is that utilitarian? I can't remember. But yeah, most of the time when they make public health things, it's focused on trying to do the best for the most amount of people.
Yeah, so that comes back to sort of the basis of beneficence, doing good for the patient.
And the second part, how have these been justified by each party?
Can you guys hear us?
The volume is fine, thank you.
I think that the policymakers would, as I don't know who it was saying it before, but the policymakers do want to do what's right for the greater good and for everyone. And sometimes that there are people that either aren't in that bracket because they're either above the bracket or below the bracket. I think that the policymakers are doing their best with what they have to include everyone, but sometimes there are things and people that makes people fall inside or outside the bracket, and it's just the way that the world is going to be covered by something like this because of being either under it or over it. So it just depends on individual circumstances, but the policy include everyone within it.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. So Blotch was talking about earlier in the article, for those who've read it, that in terms of the justification for the government being able to do what they do, is that there is a budget, and that budget usually comes from another budget, and then in the end, health costs money, and they are limited in their ability to provide free healthcare to the community. And in Australia, especially, we've done quite a good job of balancing that policy in trying to bring about the greatest care to the largest number of people possible.
Can I ask you, do you think that it's about not having the money there within the budget, or do you think it's that there are other priorities that trump health as an expenditure item? What do you think? I mean, I don't have the answer to this. I'm just asking for your opinions, and just in terms of your commentary on the public purse and how money is actually spent. Is it the fact that health expenditure is not prioritised as some other areas within society, or is it really the fact that health is prioritised as just not the money there? It is a priority, but that it's at the maximum of the public purse. What do you guys think?
I personally think that we do have a large budget as a nation, and that, I haven't read the budget personally to detail that they do each year, but there does seem to be a lot of money spread around between various areas, and that if they were really trying to find a lot more money for the health budget, I think there is a bit of leeway there. But I think it comes back to what Blotch was talking about, that there's an overall budget and they allocate sections. And the fact that our health budget is smaller is because we also have to have a military budget and a infrastructure budget. So I'm not quite sure exactly where the leeway would fall, what budgets would miss out and to achieve a greater health budget. But I don't particularly think it's a shortage of money rather than sort of different uses for that income.
Because you certainly hear it being sold in terms of political, the political message. It tends to be one of those platforms that's strongly advocated for and sold at election times, a budget for health and a budget for education. So it certainly meets their priority, at least in terms of what's talked about. Whether it does in actuality or whether it's just rhetoric becomes a different question altogether. Thank you for that.
Question 3, as seen in the example during the early stages of the interview, the rationing of healthcare is seen to be the cause of a patient's death. So in saying that, what are the similarities and differences between the ethical argument of health rationing in the aging population and this case of psychological care?
So just to confirm there what the scenario was, from memory, it was the provision of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, for this elderly patient, which was considered to be a more effective treatment modality than antidepressant medication or pharmaceutical products. And there wasn't the provision to actually give him the ECT in the rural part of Australia in which he lived, and he subsequently actually he passed away. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes. So I think that to rephrase the question a little bit, what's the difference between rationing people's healthcare in regards to the ageing population that we've talked about in previous weeks? So holding back on services for them because they are coming to the end of life, and holding back on services for someone in psychological health sector.
I think like a similarity could be between sort of like the purpose of the money. Like people think that putting the money into ageing population isn't worthwhile. And I guess putting the money into having the ECT in a rural area, which they probably wouldn't use very much, if at all, there's not as much of a purpose there as if they put the money into a different setting, not rural, where more people could use it. So I guess it's sort of like how much they're getting out of the money that they're using between those two.
That's a good point, Charlotte. Yeah. So it's about how far the dollar goes, really. Yeah.
Can you think of any differences between them?
I think there's differences between like psychological care in Australia, I think, and all mental illness. I think as a nation, we take a kind of back foot approach towards psychological care. We kind of maybe ignore the issue for our ageing population, which is we're really at the forefront of trying to make sure that our elderly population are comfortable in their health. I feel like as we're just kind of not really there in terms of looking after our people that are with mental illnesses within population cities, and then also within rural populations as well.
That's a good point too. So it's about how far up the pecking order in terms of priority these issues, these demographics are. That's a
Yeah. So then, in terms of that, the pecking order, I think the question that we'll talk about soon is who decides that pecking order, and who determines what is more important and where that money goes. Is it policymakers or is it medical professionals?
Okay, so for the next article, Article 2, so we'll just also give another rundown on what this article is. It's written regarding the complexity of rationing that is present for health professionals and its doctors, and it's good reasoning used to find a balance between private and public health and treatment interests.
So to summarise, the article kind of outlines the two responsibilities of medical personnel to both protect the individual provide for their needs and advocate for the public and their interests. So these oppose one another in regards to resource allocation, and as a result, medical practitioners are seemingly forced by a responsibility and policy to ration out resources to patients. The author suggests that to have both care to the individual and their needs as well as the public is falsely available and is currently not a viable option of ethics, but rather that rationing of resources is the functional outcome.
So, first sort of question is that the article outlines the issues of patient care and public interest in regard to health clinicians. So what ethical principles come into play in this article in regards to the medical practitioner being responsible for caring for the patient and the public at the same time? How about we go with Lara?
I guess it's Wait, you're talking about like the principles as in like autonomy, beneficence?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. I'm not really sure. I guess it's kind of justice, because they want to do the best for their patients, but that's also what's best for the public as well. So I'm not sure. I don't know, sorry.
That's good, Laura. So the doctor is trying to do what's best for their patient, but also for the public. So they're trying to be justified in their actions to the public, and provide all of the community the best healthcare they can get. Is anyone able to suggest a principle they use in regard to an individual patient, what their goal is with each patient?
It would be beneficence then, wouldn't it? You want to do the best for the patient, so you want to do good.
Yeah. So they're conflicted as to how they can provide the community with a high level of care and the individual with a high level of care, considering they both draw away resources from one another. And so they're kind of been, the article describes how your medical practitioners, in particular the GPs, are being pulled away from each option by the opposing health group, and that the community is drawing from the individual and the individual is drawing from the community, and how that causes ethical issues for the doctor, as that's their responsibility to care for them for both groups.
On to the second question. So it's, can we argue in an ethical way of rationing health services and resources? Is this possible?
That's an interesting question.
I would think not, because you can't satisfy everyone's needs and wants. As you said at the beginning, if it's like someone needs to use lots of health resources and another person doesn't, you can't then necessarily take away the money from them just because they don't use it. But yeah, so I don't think there's really any possible way to do it that's fair for absolutely everyone. Yeah.
There's always winners and losers, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
May I have your attention, please? The library will be closing in 30 minutes. Library laptops are due for return now. You're required to leave the building at closing time. The library will reopen under study hall conditions for university students and staff only. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so Charlotte was saying that there is no ethical way that you can see that you can ration healthcare services ethically.
No, not really.
No. Can anyone else, does anyone else have an opinion on this, a thought, any experiences? What about Sebastian? Have you sort of got an opinion on is there an ethical way that you can see rationing as appropriate in this option?
In regards to the lady that said it before, I think it comes down to consequentialism as well. I mean, especially in this article, the second one, being a rural area, I can't see healthcare being rationed properly to determine the outcome of a patient, whether they be elderly or younger. So yeah, I agree with the first one. I don't think it can be. You can't please everyone.
What about this idea that we touched on earlier on in the session, this idea of individual accountability and responsibility for one's own health, and the public purse sort of footing the bill when people make perhaps behavioural choices that aren't in their own interests, so people who've had heart surgery and continue to smoke. Does there come a point where, because of the rationing of health services, the system itself needs to actually say, well, you know what, no longer will this actually be funded with that public purse, and now individuals take responsibility for the health choices you make and the cost associated with the health choices you make? Do you think that that can be justified from an ethical standpoint? Forget about the practicality of it, just from an ethics perspective, looking at moral reasoning.
I think ethically that makes more sense, as people are responsible for their own health. But then it's also, you've got to somewhat prove that their heart was that way because they smoked. Whereas if, say, I needed heart surgery and have smoked 2 puffs of a cigarette in my life, then how that could possibly then come back onto that. And then with that rationale, I wouldn't get that surgery because they might think that it was because I've smoked or something like that. So I think, to me, I think that's a better solution because people are responsible for that. They should eat and behave the way that they should. But I think it's sort of an impossibility to sort of prove that it comes from poor lifestyle choices, I guess.
Okay. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So in terms of that, that idea that it's difficult to prove that things were from lifestyle choices, so would that require us to pretend, like, is there any potential ways to get around that? Checklists or things that people must meet before they can access healthcare services?
Possibly.
I think there is, Charlotte, did you say possible?
I said possibly, but I don't, I think that's also quite a hard thing to do as well, but yeah.
It's a bit of a stretch of a question, but...
I think that
Is that you, Holly?
Yeah. Sorry. Really bad.
Holly, your audio is playing up, so I'm not sure whether you wanted to turn your mic on and off and have a bit of a fiddle with it, but at the moment you sound like you're from Star Wars. Have a bit of a play with it and see if you can come back online, because we'd like to know what you wanted to say there. I mean, it becomes problematic, doesn't it? It really, with limited, I do wonder whether it will be like a demerit point system. So we have a number of points. If we make good choices, we'll get to that point or that kitty. If we make bad choices, we get demerits office, and then that sort of dictates our entitlements to these services. It would be interesting to see how it all eventuates, because the reality is there's more and more pressure on this public purse. And I do wonder how much of this really informs some of the discussion, the debate about things like euthanasia, whether that's more about people given autonomy to make decisions and choices, or whether it's a system that's sort of straining under the end of life services and another option is being put into this kitty to make it more durable and sustainable long term. I mean, that's a cynic in me that's sort of posing that question. But I do wonder, how much of it is inspired by that rationalisation argument in terms of the sustainability of the health system and expenses.
Yeah, I personally think the most ethical way is to focus on preventative health, so trying to encourage people to exercise and things like that. But I guess then doesn't rely on that sort of demerit point system sort of thing. Yeah, I think preventative health is the best way to relieve strain off the public purse. Yeah.
And there's a lot of evidence to show that that is the most economically efficient, isn't it?
Yeah.
That it does, in fact, the expenditure on health prevention is money well spent in terms of the cost savings.
Yeah. Is Holly back? No?
We might just move on to question 3.
We might move on to the next question. If Holly pops back, we can jump back to that question. So, as medical practitioners, we saw the other week, they follow an oath that they have to read out as they are sort of initiated as medical practitioners. That sort of sums up medical practitioners' ideologies, or the medical ideologies that they need to follow.
So the question being from that, is there a conflict of interest in medical personnel, and are they trying to balance public health interests as well as providing a high level of care to individual patients?
I mean, we hear all the time anecdotal stories about people who are actually encouraged or pushed out, not even so much encouraged, the terms are usually stronger, pushed out of a hospital bed to free up the bed, but they weren't quite ready to go home, or they were telling, you know, staff in the hospital that they had more symptoms, but no one really cared because there was pressure to get people out so you could free up the beds. I don't know, do you think that there is a bit of a conflict there in terms of the resources and managing the interests of the public at large, sometimes with individual patients and what they need? That's essentially your question, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I don't know. Rachel, what do you study?
Yeah, I definitely think there's a conflict of interest between the two. Like, even, for example, my auntie just had her hip done because she broke her hip, and she was pushed out of a hospital bed in 2 weeks, but she's still not healed, so she's at home. Now she's got to go to her GP and pay for, you know, get a referral to pay to see a physio, which is going to cost her more. So, yeah, it's definitely conflicting with stuff like that. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to comment.
That's good. So in terms of the public side, has anyone ever had any experiences where the public seems to have missed out for the health of the individual? As a healthcare community of allied health professionals and other health professionals, do we often see people falling short as the individual, or the public falling short in terms of health services? Or is there a mix?
Can you guys hear me yet?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. I don't have video though, but I do have audio.
That's fine.
So I think that the public health loses out in terms of the fact that sometimes we treat people that maybe sometimes don't necessarily want to be treated. For example, like a smoker that's got emphysema, they keep going back into hospital and keep getting more treatment for having, you know, an issue that they're causing upon themselves. And then in terms of the flip side of that, I think that sometimes people do need treatment that need help, such as those in rural communities, but don't have access to it. So I think that there is kind of like it's not a good balance, but there is a balance between the public being strained and like the government resources being strained versus the fact that people aren't receiving treatment when they should or when they need to.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and that they are being strained. There is, as we were talking about before, and Liz mentioned, that there is a budget and there's a limit, and it's being stretched and strained in two directions. Especially as the second article was talking about, that doctors have a responsibility through their oath to the public sector and to the private individual, but also by policy, because of the policies that the government has come up with in terms of the rationing and how Medicare works. They can't stretch it. There's not a lot of leeway in terms of providing care for those who need it, and saving money where the government suggests that we should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so pretty much to draw everything to a close, we conclude that there is a need for rationing of health resources, and that they should be set for health professionals to decide, as Blotch did argue in the first article. But there's no easy way as to how to best ration these resources other than professional opinion and deliberation among the healthcare team.
Mm-hmm.
Just one final question, just to compare the two articles. So both articles are arguing the rationing of health services and resources versus the need for personalised care of all patients to the level that they require. So are there any opinions as to whether this idea of rationing is ethical?
That audio was a bit soft. I'm not sure whether others heard you, but can I just get you to summarise that last question again, or that last comment? I didn't quite catch it.
So
is rationing being done in our country without the input of farmers?
I didn't catch it again. I'm not sure whether others did or not. Did others hear that okay?
No.
No. Okay.
So is in Australia, in terms of Medicare and the political input, is rationing being done in Australia without bias, or is it biased rationing?
That's a good question. Now that I've heard it, third time. Good question. Is there bias in terms of the health funding and expenditure? Does it in one way or the other? And if so, what way? That's an interesting question. What
Josh?
do you think?
I think there's always going to be.
Your attention, please. The
Sorry.
line is closing in 15 minutes. If you wish to borrow, please do so now. You must leave the podium closing and take your belongings with you. The library will reopen under study hall conditions. Entry will require a valid university staff or student ID card. Thank you.
Sorry, Josh. Please.
Sorry, could you repeat the question just so I got my answer right?
Yeah.
Okay, so in Australia, is rationing done without any input of bias?
Nah, I think there's always going to be some form of bias there. I think everyone's got their own preconceived notions towards people and different types of people, whether it's race or like gender or whatever like that. There's always going to be some form of bias, and I don't know really, like that needs to be changed, but yeah, that's what I think. Yeah.
I would tend to agree. Yeah, I would say that whilst ever health administration is in the hands of politicians and political decision making is influenced by the vote, there will always be a discrepancy as to where the money's spent. I'm not sure whether others agree in terms of that, but it tends to follow, the dollar tends to follow those who have the political voice, to be certain populations within the Australian community, I think, unfortunately.
Yeah, there definitely is a sort of a bias as to who makes the policies and where those people lie in our communities.
Does anyone have any other questions they want to throw out or anything?
Okay, well, thank you guys for your presentation. So, and thank you everybody for your participation today. So just again, a few reminders for those who logged in a little bit late. Remember that your online create tasks continue for this week, as does your online quiz. This is the last week for the online quiz. And then in 10 and 11, there is no quiz. Make sure that you start your major essay preparation early and take note of the hints that I gave you earlier on in the tutorial in terms of both the structure and the content. And please do post any other queries or questions that you might have online in the discussion thread. Just before I let you go, any final questions or queries?
Can I just ask a question in terms of because it says create task and then there's one that goes into our learning journal. Does those go towards our participation marks?
Yeah, so all of the create tasks do. So whether
okay, but just the create section, not the reflect, or?
No, the reflect tasks don't, just the create tasks. The reflect tasks
cool.
Thinking questions to help prompt you to consider the main themes or the elements of the learning material for that week.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
That's all right. All good. And I will double check for you the visibility of the grades for those of you who have already done your seminar presentation. So thank you all, one and all, and I'll have a good week and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Thanks for
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.